Hello, hello. Welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me today once again is Courtney Stewart. Courtney, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks. What have you got going on this week?
Um, well, as always, I can be found on Atheist Edge. But we sort of I think we put out videos every week. That's really up to Jim. He's sort of the ringleader of that show, so I don't claim too much ownership of that. So probably having things published this week on Atheist Edge. I might be in them, I might not. I don't know. Um, but I've got my cats with me this time, and we're in the light of day, so I think my lighting is a lot a lot today.
Yeah, I gotta. This whole. Oh, I need to redo everything in here. So hold on. I got breaking news here from New York Times. Courtney Stewart hangs up on her mother. What? What is? Where did it?
Oh no. My mother just called me before we were setting up, and I was like, "No, I can't talk to my mom right now. I just got this all set up, and like I'm afraid if I accept a phone call that everybody's going to go away and I'm going to mess things up." So I'm like, "No, once we're set up, I'm like, yay, keep it that way." That's the
As a
plan.
father, I very strongly disagree with your sensibilities on that one. As the
I'm
host
sure.
here, I very strongly agree with where you landed on that. In time is far more important. You can call your, I mean, you can call her back whenever
Indeed.
you want. All right.
Indeed.
Well,
So,
so
so yes, you can find me on Atheist Edge. You can also find me on Women of Deconversion on Secular Hangouts. That's not actively going anymore, but you can watch the past videos, which I really love those amazing conversations. Um, and I'm also on a lot of different people's channels. I've been on Truth Wanted. I've been on the Atheist Christian Book Club, which Richard Carrier was nice enough to join us for an episode of that as well. And I have done an interview with Richard Carrier before, besides that one, and that was really fun as well. Um, and I am a counselor by trade for children. My degree is in psychology, and a lot of what I talk about is psychology. That's my angle into the conversation usually. And I have in the past been president of Metroplex Atheists in Dallas, Texas. So I'm still a board member. I'm not president anymore, but I'm president in my heart.
well, and I actually just booked. Uh, oh my God, Faithless Forum. So I'm going to be there, and we had talked about this,
Oh yeah.
and yeah. So I know you're reasonably close, aren't you?
Yeah, well, they're going to be in Austin this year. They were in Dallas last couple years, so I was definitely able to go to that. I'm debating this year. It's in Austin. I love those guys down there at the Atheist Community of Austin. It's great. It's a great venue and a great place. So we'll see. I might be there, maybe.
All right, well, I'm gonna stream from there. We're gonna In Time's gonna we're gonna cover it. We're gonna do something. Non Sequitur did that. I thought actually Kyle Curtis was streaming from the hotel room, but interviewing people. I actually really
Hmm.
liked it. So who knows?
Hmm.
Maybe do something like that. So
Yeah.
let's see. We've got on Tuesday coming up. It's going to be Super Tuesday. We're going to be covering that. We're going to have a number of people. Mikey Fairman. We're going to have hopefully Dave McGinnis and Landon Knoll to cover Super Tuesday. We're going to start about an hour before polls close, and we're going to see whether or not Sanders is going to end up being the presumptive nominee, which I think is a decent possibility. But Super Tuesday is I think almost half the delegates awarded overall is going to be awarded on Super Tuesday coming up. And the next day, we're going to be on with Landon again to discuss the impeachment. We've had him on a couple of times discussing impeachment. He actually was a government official, impeached a governor, if I recall. Was it? Oh my God, I don't know. We'll ask him. But he wanted to discuss. We wanted to discuss with him sort of the consequences of having failed to remove the president from office. He was successfully impeached, but the process did not result in a conviction. And what does that mean? Does that embolden him? What's going to go on with him from then on? And then we're going to have on Godless Mom the week after that, covering prison reform. I think that's going to be
Oh, that sounds so
uh,
interesting.
Oh God, yeah. The U.S. prison system's it's actually killing us. It's
It's the
really.
cheeriest subject of subjects.
This is, well, as you know, so I've actually written 2 books. The first was The Water Thief, which was the rebuttal to Atlas Shrugged, but the second one was Confessions of a Sin Eater. I co-authored it with a prison psychologist who was a psychologist at he was a psychologist at a supermax facility for 10 years. And yeah, I remember when he's
Oh, I'm
trying to
so
convince me to
excited
go in
about
his.
this conversation.
Yeah, this
So
is. I think
excited.
it's going to be good. Courtney's discussed this for a while. It was actually why I was on Non-Sec. The very first time I did another channel was Non-Sec, and it was to discuss prison reform. So
Mm.
that's going to be great. And then, yeah, I remember those like, Nick, you've got to come in. I'm going to take you to prison. You're going to see it. I was like, why? Because you need to smell evil. I was just okay.
Oh
He was
no.
he was an intense guy. Yeah. We'll talk about that then. We've also got Cyrus coming up on the 17th, Cyrus the Skeptic. We love having him on. He's going to be back on again. And then we also have an Anglican minister, Martin Joss, is going to be on the week after that to discuss what I'm calling no true Christian Scotsman. How the no true Scotsman argument applies sort of to Christians amongst themselves and from anti-theists in regards to Christianity, because for me as an anti-theist, I'm always like, look, 3,000 mutually excommunicative sects of Christianity. Give me a break. They can't all be right, but they can't all be wrong. But he's a good guy.
And Nick, I think you have to choose one. You have to either say no true Christian or the no true Scotsman fallacy. I'm not sure you can really combine them together.
Yeah, excuse me. Between the two of us, no. Between the two of us, who's got the degree in philosophy?
Wait,
no. I'm not going to let you get away with that. I'm not going to let you get away with that. I can't. Wow. Okay. We're going to have to see. Do I have control over her mic?
My days are numbered on this channel.
Oh no, you can come on as often as you like. I'm just going to hit the mute button. Of course, Gould never lets me have it. He never lets me have it. I don't know, but that's probably why not.
And you have like psychology and philosophy. I just have psychology over here, so I should kind of bow to the
but yours is
much
further than mine. I bailed at basically the BA level. And this the philosophy, and this is good because this segues into who we've got now. His degree is in ancient history, if I recall, but he
much higher credentials than either of us.
Yeah. So, but there's the one of the reasons I didn't get a PhD in philosophy, because I was thinking about this. Did you hear the one about the what did the employed philosopher say to the unemployed philosopher? Would you like fries with that? Yeah. Anyways, so what we've got is and then somebody in the live chat said
that's even worse.
That. Yeah, I don't know. They're giving me a hard time for muting myself, and I always fall for it too. They're like, "Nick, are you muted?" Oh, God. All right. Yeah, my own personal troll is in the live chat. The only thing is he friggin' works on the channel with me. That's what I get for hiring Mikey. So we have on today Dr. Richard Carrier. We're going to bring him out in a second, and he's got. I'm going to ask him to clarify. If I recall, it's a degree in ancient history, and we've spoken a bit about this and a couple other topics. But the historical consensus is Jesus was a real figure. Didn't necessarily walk on water, do any of those things, but he was a real figure. And Dr. Carrier has said, I don't think so. So, Richard, why don't we bring Dr. Carrier out here? And Dr. Carrier, welcome to In Time.
Greetings. Good to be here.
Well, thank you very much for coming. We actually first talked about this probably 3 or 4 months ago, and so we managed to get you on. You are in high demand, so we got you on for this, and we'll talk about one other topic that we'd like to get you back for later on. But thank you very much for joining us. So could you tell us a little bit about first of all your background, and then just who are you? What do you do? And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my PhD is in ancient history from Columbia University. The specializations are religion, philosophy, and science, intellectual history, so history of philosophy and so on. My dissertation was on attitudes towards the scientist in the early Roman Empire. So that's why, and there's a whole backstory as to why I did that and how that connects to modern Christian apologetics and things like that. So that is also an area that I'm expert in and love to talk about, and when people are interested in it. So yeah, hopefully I'll be back to talk to you about that subject, the history of science and Christianity's role in it, and the rhetoric from both sides about it.
I'm excited about that one.
Me too.
I love the subject, right? Obviously. So, when I got my PhD, it was 2008, and the economy collapsed. So it's basically freezes on hires for humanities majors. So basically, there was no professorships to go get. And I had about $20,000 of student debt left over, which is low, actually, for most folks who get all the way to PhD. But so I put out to my fans, I said, if you can raise a $20,000, like a grant, a research grant, I will apply my PhD skills to any subject you want. My fans did raise the money. So they actually got the 20 grand and basically put together the equivalent of a postdoc research grant. I was working independently, but unanimously, they all said historicity of Jesus. We don't care what your conclusion is. We just want you to apply your ancient history PhD. Then you would be the first one to have actually done this. And then publish something under peer review on it, like whether it's pro or con or whatever it happens to be. And that led to like a 6-year research project and multiple books. And in particular, I did the book on method first, which is Proving History, where I talk about how Bayes' theorem underlies all historical reasoning. And once you realize that, you can actually analyze and critique historical reasoning better. Otherwise, it's all vague gut feelings and stuff. But if you really want to get to what is it that historians are actually doing, Bayes' theorem is the key, and that book is about what you can do with that information. And then that has a chapter on it on why the methods for studying the historical Jesus don't work. And in fact, I found several studies, peer-reviewed studies by historians in the Jesus studies field, specifically on the methods being used, and all those studies agreed that the methods don't work. And yet they still keep using them. So that was kind of a startling discovery. And then I analyzed, like, what do you do about that situation? And why is that situation the way it is, and so on. And that's Proving History. But the culmination of my research was on the historicity of Jesus, which was published by Sheffield Phoenix Press, which is a renowned peer-reviewed academic biblical studies press. And that came out in 2014. And that was a big controversial thing because it was the first book published about the historicity of Jesus specifically, published in 100 years, pro or con, mind you. There hasn't been a book arguing for the historicity of Jesus since about 1923. It's just been an assumption in the field all this time. And so I was the first one to actually challenge this presumption under peer review, like actually get this happening. So in that sense, it kind of makes me analogous to Thomas Thompson in the 70s, who did the same thing with Moses and the patriarchs, and the same outrage followed. And it took 10 to 20 years for his views to be accepted. But now it's pretty much the mainstream consensus is that the Moses and the patriarchs are mythical people, that they're made up. They're the same kind of mythical role that Hercules and other mythical people play in Greek mythology and Inanna and Tammuz and stuff in Sumerian and so on. So that's kind of like, no one really blinks at that anymore, except, of course, Christian fundamentalists freak out still about this. But so I'm basically making the same case that possibly Jesus didn't exist. And I have to make clear, like, my conclusion is the upper margin of my error, the upper range of my margin of error is 1 in 3 chance that there was a Jesus, which is actually respectably high. So I'm not claiming to be certain that there was no Jesus. I think you can construct historical Jesuses that are compatible with the evidence for sure. I just think the preponderance of evidence suggests that maybe those models don't work, that they're not the correct ones. But I don't assert that that's necessarily true. So like I said, 1 in 3 chance, maybe there's some historical Jesus. But what pisses everybody off and freaks everybody out is that's below 50%, and people just can't handle that. So that's what makes me controversial.
Well, and I think you're. Oh, sorry. I think you're on the if you're not being as generous, it was like 1 in 20 is what you had. Is that right?
Oh no, 1 in 12,000 on the bottom end.
Oh.
But mind you,
I think
that's actually
I thought
not.
I remembered that.
that's not as low as you think either. If I told you that there's a 1 in 12,000 chance your car would explode when you got into it, you wouldn't get into it. So 1 in 12,000 is not really that low. Like, it's not like 1 billion to 1 or something. It's not the existence of God.
To be
probably
fair,
trillions to 1.
To be fair, with my wife driving, there's about that chance that we're gonna get into some kind of car wreck, and I get in them with her.
Well, car wreck,
but,
sure.
You know,
yeah, but explode.
Yeah, well, she's okay. To be fair, but so we have it now.
But the point being is that
so
I don't think we can be sure, right? Like that we can't be certain that it's that low. I think that's my estimate. But if I assume a premise is as much against my assumption as possible, and I'm being as generous as possible to the historicity thesis, in order to compensate for possible bias in my reasoning, that's where you get the 1 in 3. So I say it's somewhere in between those two values. We can't be confident that it is either one. It's just somewhere in there, and that's still controversial enough, I think, to assert.
All right. Well, so the general consensus is that Jesus was real. So not necessarily that he was the Son of God or any of the other Christian claims, but that he was real. There's presumably a few other sources that suggest that he was real. So what is sort of the evidence that says maybe he was real, and why, in your view, is that not compelling?
Yeah, it depends on who you're arguing with, like how competent and knowledgeable they are as to what they will focus on as evidence. But usually what people will say is, well, Tacitus mentions Jesus, Josephus mentions Jesus. But there's problems with those. There are many problems with those.
Okay, don't get into all the ones I'm going to hit you with later. I'm waiting to ambush you with those later. Yeah. You don't do, oh my God, okay.
Yeah.
That's just like two-thirds of my script out the window.
Yeah, the main problem with them is that we can't establish that they are using any sources other than the Gospels. So you can't cite someone who's citing someone else as corroboration. Right? Like, so that's useless evidence. So that leaves us with the Gospels, really. And the Gospels are the first time we hear of a very definite assertion that he was a historical guy walking around Galilee doing stuff. And the Gospels are deeply problematic. So they're heavily mythical in the way they're constructed. They don't have the markers of actual what's called rational history that even existed at that time. Before the Gospels, we get to the epistles, right? And many of those are forged. Mainstream consensus agrees we have to throw some of them out as unknown date by unknown authors. But there are at least 7 that we generally agree that Paul definitely wrote them, most likely in the 50s AD. And so the real controversy hinges there. Like the epistles of Paul are weirdly silent about the historical Jesus. They never mention Galilee. They never mention Nazareth. They never mention, they never explicitly say Romans killed him. They never, like, the epistles are very vague. They never say he was a miracle worker. They never say he was an exorcist. They never talk about parables. So they're very vague as to whether there's a historical Jesus. And that's a problem. And historicists will try to make excuses for that. But just because you have an excuse for it doesn't make the problem go away. It's still weird. And then what happens is they'll try to focus on some of the ambiguous passages and try to build historicity off of those. And I'd say, and I point this out in the book, and I even count these as evidence for historicity. In my final calculation, a lot of people get this wrong. They assume that I just dismiss it. Now, I have good reasons to dismiss them. Nevertheless, I put them back in and count them as evidence for historicity, and I still only get a 1 in 3 chance that Jesus existed. And those passages are ones referring to his family. So there are ambiguous references to Jesus maybe having a father, maybe having a mother, and maybe having brothers. But those passages are really super vague and ambiguous and strange in and of themselves. And so they aren't as good evidence as people think they are, because there are actually other explanations for those passages. And so that's the problem. And I think really the debate, like the real serious debate, hinges on that. How do we interpret those passages in the epistles? Everything else is weak tea as far as evidence goes. And I've made this point on my blog. For people who want to find all things Richard Carrier, my Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, my blog, my books, everything, recommendations for readings and everything, is at richardcarrier.info. It's .info. But you can go there into my blog, and I've written several blogs on comparing other historical figures, Spartacus, Hannibal, Pontius Pilate, and what kind of historical evidence we have for these people. And it's always better. Socrates is a good example. We have much better evidence for Socrates. If we had the evidence for Jesus that we have for Socrates, this would be a no-brainer. My book would have concluded, yeah, we should conclude that there was a Jesus, or at least more probably than not that there was a Jesus. But that's not how things turned out. The evidence is way, way worse than this. It's worse than all of these guys. And people want to find that. I recommend people go to my Spartacus one. So go to my blog, search my blog for Spartacus, and that one has the opening paragraph lists, and I keep updating it. It lists every other comparison I've made, from Emperor Trajan, Alexander the Great, like all of these. I keep doing more and more because people keep coming up with new ones. And you can find links or references to all of them. So you can, that's the one-stop shop. You can find all the examples there and really explore them. But my article on Hannibal really gets at the theory, the underlying reason why these examples don't work to sort of compare to Jesus. And so if you really want to understand why the evidence is problematic for Jesus, the Hannibal article is probably a good one to look at.
So
we'll
can I
make
ask,
sure that gets in the description.
Yeah. Can I ask, so I don't think I understood this before, that the evidence that other historians use to conclude that Jesus was probably a real person is only from scripture. It's not from any like other corroborating evidence or texts.
Generally, there are mainstream historians who will assign weak value to, for example, Tacitus and Josephus. But when you really look at like Van Voorst, for instance, Van Voorst wrote a book, Jesus Outside the New Testament. His conclusion is that this evidence is weak tea. Like for the same reason that I just pointed out, that we can't establish that these authors have any other sources in the Gospels. So they don't really corroborate the Gospels. We can't use them as evidence. Many historians will concede that. So even Bart Ehrman will sort of concede it, but like at the same time, wishy-washy, sort of like, well, maybe this is kind of evidence. We're not really sure. But ultimately, like if you really look at it logically, like that evidence isn't useful. It just gets us back to the Gospels, which we already have. Usually the fight is over the New Testament, like you said. It's like it's a fight over, can we get history out of the Gospels? There are some arguments that people try to build out of that. And then can we get historicity out of the epistles? And there's some arguments around that. But yes, you're right. Like really our only sources are, like you said, the Bible, and even later authors who were writing about Christianity, like Tacitus and Josephus. So far as we know, their only source was the Bible. So they didn't have any independent way in, so to speak.
So Tacitus had said that that Nero actually blamed the Christians, and I think he let's see, was it? He blamed the Christians who were seeking revenge for the killing of Jesus.
That's not what he says, but go on.
Burning.
He doesn't say that. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, yeah. Well, then let's clarify what he says then, because that's so. Okay, let's get into that.
What Tacitus actually says, he tells a story, and I'm just going to summarize it. He said, first of all, Rome burned. This was a huge catastrophic event. And a lot of people were blaming Nero for it. There was a lot of like your typical conspiracy theories, like, well, he burned it down so he could build a bigger palace and stuff like that. Probably not true, but nonetheless, he was getting blamed for it. So according to Tacitus, he tried to come up with scapegoats, someone to blame for it, that he could assuage the accusations and keep the public happy. And he picked the Christians, because Tacitus says everybody thinks the Christians hate everybody. Or hate the world or hate humanity or something like this. People just didn't like the Christians. And so he picked on them and then blamed them for the arson. And it even says, like in he actually got several of them to confess to committing arson, probably under torture, which is another example of why torture doesn't work. But although there is an interesting case to be made that the Christians really did burn Rome, because there's a passage in 2 Peter where they expect the world to burn down. Maybe some Christians decided they wanted to like speed that along, kind of like the Armageddon lobby today wants to have a war between Israel and the Arab countries around it in order to start World War III, in order to start the end of the world. Maybe there were Christians doing that. We don't really have evidence of this, but anyway, that's what Tacitus says. Is this happened? And then people started to have sympathy for the Christians because of the horrible way Nero was killing them. But in the midst of all of this, he has one line where he tries to explain who these Christians are. And he says the origin of the name is this guy named Christ who Pontius Pilate crucified under Tiberius. and then that's sort of suppressed the religion, but then it's sprung up again, and here it is, and here we are. And so that's the line. So you say like, oh, well, he's saying Jesus was a historical person. But Tacitus doesn't say like, oh, I checked the Roman archives and confirmed there was this actual Christ who actually started this religion, who was crucified by. No, he just tells this line, which is really a Christian line. It's the Christian story, comes right out, basically out of the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus was crucified under Tiberius, and or even Mark, you get it from that, but crucified under Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. So we can't really establish that line came from it. Now, there's actually reasons to suspect that Tacitus didn't even write that line. So there's a bigger problem. But even if you want to like, bypass that debate and just say, let's just admit that Tacitus wrote it, just assume that for the sake of argument, even if that's the case, the evidence is not useful because we don't know where Tacitus got that information. Now, we do know, or have good reason to believe, where he got some of his information about this event. And that was the history of Rome by Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder was there in the 60s AD, during the fire, and he wrote a history of Rome up to the end of Nero's reign. And we know this. It was a very influential history. A lot of people wrote it or used it as a source. Tacitus, we know, used it as a source. But Tacitus doesn't say, for example, as Pliny the Elder said, Christ was crucified by blah, blah, blah. So we don't know where Tacitus is getting that piece of information. Is that in the history of Pliny the Elder? That history is gone, by the way. It doesn't survive. Now, if Pliny the Elder had discussed Christianity in there, there's no way it would have disappeared. They would have been referenced by either the enemies or the friends of Christianity. They would have been citing it, quoting it as proof for all their points about the history of Christianity, or they'd be attacking it, defending themselves against whatever rhetoric was in there. So like, one way or another, there would be a reference to it. So the fact that no one knows, no one had ever heard of Pliny the Elder talking about Christians, kind of tells us he didn't, which actually supports the conclusion that actually didn't happen, or at least didn't happen the way Tacitus writes the story. But we don't know that for sure. Now, I'll intrigue you, however, that there is a possibility we can answer this question. And for those who don't know, there's actually a library intact, a first-century library under the ashes of Herculaneum in Italy. And most of the books are still there. They're charred, and we started excavating in the 19th century. We gave up because the books were falling apart and you couldn't do much with them. But now people are starting to use CAT scans, coaxial or computerized axial tomography, tomography with X-rays to try and see it. We could use particle accelerators. We did that with an Archimedes book once. Various ways of trying to extract the information. So we just need a budget to go in and get these books and now unravel them. Now, mind you, Pliny the Elder died during the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Herculaneum. He was trying to rescue people, and he actually lived right across the bay from it. So the probability that this library has a book from a local luminary who lived there, lived in the region, the fact that Pliny's history could be there, like it could actually be sitting there right now for us to go get. And then wouldn't that be a big scandal if we go and look at that and his account of the fire of Nero does not mention Christians at all, or something even more scandalous. So anyway, that's a side note. But it's a thing that I would love to see happen. I'm kind of eagerly waiting for some billionaire to step up and start doing this.
Well, it sounds like, and actually I've got two questions for you. I want to ask both those questions. Well, no, let me ask this first, and then I'll hit the two questions. The first is, so it sounds a bit like one of the reasons you conclude that Jesus probably wasn't real was because of a lack of evidence where you would expect to otherwise find it. Is that sort of inaccurate? It sounds to me like that's
no, actually, no. In my book on the historicity of Jesus, in chapter 8, I conclude that the lack of evidence is not dispositive at all. However, that requires admitting that, and this is uncomfortable for Christians, but it requires admitting that Jesus was a nobody. You have to say that he was a completely uninfluential nobody that nobody gave a shit about and no one wrote about.
Okay.
Which is entirely possible. It's entirely possible. So you can grant that, but you have to grant that to avoid this argument. If you're going to say that Jesus was, as the Gospels claim, famed all across Syria, that he did all these amazing things, the triumphal entry and all this other stuff, then yes, the silence of the evidence really refutes that Jesus. That Jesus can't have existed. But you can retreat to what mainstream scholars do retreat to, which is, oh, he was really kind of like one of the most minor, like there were more popular messianic figures, and he was just like a nobody, hardly noticed, and no one wrote about him. That's entirely possible. And the only people who cared were this small band of fanatical followers who tried to revive his memory and so on. That's an entirely plausible account of events. So the absence of evidence by itself is not a problem. What's weird is when we get to the silence in the letters of Paul. That's really weird, because this isn't just some rando. This is a guy who's talking about, who's talking to the followers of this guy who died. He's a major follower of this guy. He's trying to convince them of things. He's arguing with people who supposedly were his disciples about doctrine and various things. How it could never come up, any of this stuff, is hard to explain. That's hard to explain, even if Jesus was a nobody. And so I don't consider that like decisive evidence, but it is problematic evidence. It weighs against historicity. And like I said, there's ways to explain that away, but those explanations don't get you back to above 50% probability. They're weak tea again.
All right, I'm gonna ask, and I want to get into the Bayesian, how you make those calculations. I also want to give Courtney a chance to talk, but let me ask two questions that we had from the live chat. I do have
some questions, yeah.
So the two questions I want to get to, just because we were asked that in the live chat, and then I'll pass it off to Courtney for a little while. The first was from Osmandius, Ozzy. He's a friend of the show. He wanted to know if Bart Ehrman expressed an interest in debating the issue with you in person or in print. Would you be willing to do so? And then the second question we got from Steve McCrae: what guesstimate among percentage among atheist academic scholars in theology or biblical studies would you estimate hold to mythicism?
Okay, percentage, that's a hard one to calculate. We're too early right now. I published in 2014. It's only been, what, 6 years? And hardly anyone's reading the book, so its influence is going to be limited, right? But when it came out, there were probably 3 or 4 of us, which, full qualified PhDs who at least agree with agnosticism about historicity. Now it's 12, or it's 8 to 12, depending on how you count. Renowned, or necessarily people with PhDs in a relevant field, who have admitted to at least the plausibility of being agnostic about the historicity of Jesus. So that's different from being an outright mythicist, but it is at least saying, well, this is actually a hypothesis that deserves a place at the table. And some actually like harbor serious doubts or admit to serious doubts about the historicity of Jesus. And I keep that list on my article at my blog. There's an article, Bart Ehrman recap, Bart Ehrman on historicity recap. I can't remember the exact title, but if you search Bart Ehrman recap on my blog, you find the complete list of all the debates, as so far as you can say, between Bart Ehrman and I about this. And one of the entries, entry 22 on that list, is about how many scholars and which scholars and who they are, and evidence that they at least admit to either agnosticism or the plausibility of agnosticism. So it's grown, but it's still a small number of people. But I think that's largely because it's mostly most people don't know about the book. And even those who know about the book don't read it. I find most of the criticisms I get come from scholars who didn't read the book. And then when you confront them, like, you're talking about things that aren't in the book, that aren't claimed there, and you're ignoring the things that are claimed there. And then they'll like make excuses for why they're not going to read the book. So that we have more of a, shall we say, an emotional bias to not confront or consider this hypothesis. Like they aren't acting like the way scholars should do, which is when you have a peer review, when you have a challenge to the consensus that passes peer review, that should be the warrant for you to go really seriously examine it. And if you're going to critique it, actually critique it. Like, read the actual thing and critique what it actually says. The fact that historians aren't doing that they're actually bypassing the book or ignoring most of what the book says and critiquing irrelevant or random things about it, is really suspicious. It suggests that there's a strong emotional bias to not even go there. Even among secular historians. So we've got a barrier to get past here. It's difficult to get people to sort of rethink their assumptions and be willing to actually tackle this in a serious way. So that's the big problem I've had. So like there's point being is that there are about 12 scholars now that I know of. I know there are more who won't come out as this because they don't want to get attacked or mocked or have grant money taken away and things like that. So I know there's a sort of a chill against coming out this way, but I think that might be overly exaggerated, but you know, you can't argue with how someone feels about the dangers they're in terms of whether they're going to admit this or not. The first question, yes, actually, I have long wanted to do a debate with Bart Ehrman, but he refuses because I'm too mean, according to him. Which
okay.
to translate means I caught him lying and proved it with evidence, and he doesn't like that. So, and that's all on my recap article too, if you really want to see it. Because he does this too. He makes like false arguments, gets caught making them, and then tries to weasel out of it, rather than actually read the book and confront the actual arguments of the book. But anyway, that's a whole other side issue. I would gladly debate him. And in fact, I know a group that offered him $5,000 to debate me, and he turned it down. So that's how stalwartly he's sticking his head in the sand on this one.
All right, Courtney, did you? It's all yours, Courtney.
Sure. So first of all, you mentioned there being sort of an incentive in the field to worry about funding and whether that would go away if people were to adhere to this theory or idea. And I guess I was wondering, the funding seems to a lot of the time be religious funding because universities originally in their research were religious based and funded by religious organizations. So do you think that that's part of that, or is there a deeper bias, you think, in the field about just what they've always thought that this was?
I am more inclined to think that it's a deeper bias, but I can't dismiss the fact that what you're saying is correct. Even if you look at Princeton, for example, or Chapel Hill, where Bart Ehrman teaches, they're not Christian universities per se, but their donors tend to be Christians, or at least even if they're like liberal Christians, like Anglicans or something, Episcopalians. They're very uncomfortable with this kind of radicalism. This idea of how dare you question the historicity of Jesus? It's politically unpopular. And so there could be the worry, even if the worry is unfounded, even if this wouldn't really happen. I know there are people who are nevertheless worried about it. They're worried about what will happen if they start supporting this stuff too publicly, or if professors in their department start doing it. It will create heat for them that they don't want. And that could lead to maybe a donor sending their money somewhere else, or at the very least pressure coming down. And then people don't like to deal with pressure, even if the pressure isn't going to result in anything. They still have to deal with it, and people rather not deal with shit. So I do think that that's a phenomenon that's an issue. I think it's worth pointing out also, like 2/3 of all experts, people who have PhDs in this field, are believing Christians, and in fact, mostly conservative Christians. So, so when you're talking about percentages of the field, who are you counting? If you're going to dismiss, I think you should dismiss fundamentalists. They cannot be objective, so their opinion doesn't matter for this. Like, you just exclude them. Well, now you've excluded most experts. Liberal Christians still have somewhat of a bias on this, and so really, if you get down to secular, and then professors don't usually just outright say, "Oh, I'm an atheist." Some do. But many of them, it's more popular to just not talk about politics or religion and just, hey, I'm just a biblical scholar. I'm teaching Bible stuff. Don't ask me about personal things like my religion. This literally happened to me when I went to the Society of Biblical Literature conference. And they were talking about some subject. I wrote about this on my blog too, but they were talking about some subject. And the SBL, it was the SBL, but it was the Westar Institute. Of which I'm a fellow, which famously authored the Jesus Seminar. They trend liberal, liberal-minded theologians. And I was kind of getting that sense that all these actual preachers with congregations, PhDs, but also like they actual have churches that they are responsible to, and theologians and professors and stuff are, it sounds like they're talking about like God as a metaphor, right? And so I'm thinking like, well, how many of us here, I asked, like, how many of us here actually think that? How many of us here think God is an actual supernatural person? And I was told, like we agreed we're not going to discuss that. So basically, we're going to not put anyone on the spot by making them raise their hand or not raise their hand doing this. So there's, even amongst liberals, there's a pressure to just not go there. So that has to have an effect. I can't say that it can't have any effect. But I also think there's this institutional ruts that people are rolling in. People don't like change. And you can see the same exact phenomenon with what's called Q, the so-called hypothetical Q document. In biblical studies, that you have the Gospel of Mark, and then you have Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke copy Mark verbatim, but they also have material shared between them that's verbatim that's not in Mark. So there's various ways you could explain this. And one is, well, there must have been another gospel, and we call it Q, Quelle for source in German. There must have been this other gospel that they're using the same way they're using Mark. And this got anchored in the 60s as an assumption of the field. And it started to get challenged more recently. It's always been challenged, but more assiduously, carefully, and well challenged recently by Goulder and Goodacre and these other major biblical scholars. When I first went into this, I assumed that they were the fringe scholars and that Q was well established. When I started doing the research for this, I was kind of outraged. Like when I looked at the defenses of Q and the arguments against it, it's like, I do not understand why anyone believes in Q. Like the evidence for it is the worst. And in fact, the evidence against it is pretty compelling. It's pretty obvious that Luke just used Matthew. Like that's just it. There's no secret lost hidden Q. But the institutional ruts that everybody are rolling in, it's called a juggernaut by Goulder. This idea, you can't stop it. People are just invested in it. And it's not, there's not dogma dependent on it, really. It's not like it's a religious thing per se. It's just, no, it's just Q must exist. Q must exist. And if you're challenging it, you're fringe and weird and we reject you. And so, Goulder and Goodacre and these others face the same criticisms like, oh, you're a crazy fringe person. For no reason, because objectively the evidence is on Goodacre's side. Like Goodacre's right. Like it's just, I'm sorry, he just is. But the whole institution keeps rolling in the ruts of Q. No, it's got to be Q, got to be Q. And I think the same thing happens with historicity of Jesus. It's the same sort of just blinders that we don't want to accept any kind of radical change in the way we understand anything. And we've built our whole careers on the assumption that Q and Jesus exist. So we would be repudiating our entire careers if we were to, so even atheist scholars have a bias here.
So I think there's a couple of motivations too. So one, I think that people talk a lot about there being a kind of an irrelevancy to the historicity, that what matters is whether this person was divine and the Son of God, and we can it's more useful to debate that with Christians than if it was a real person at the base of it. That it almost doesn't matter if there's a person there or not. It's more about the claims that are made in Christianity. So that's kind of one that I think maybe people are at least avoiding the topic, or just saying, oh, well, just it's fine. It doesn't matter, because what matters is whether it's a supernatural being. Do you find that at all in the field, or people having sort of dismissing the topic as a whole instead of just the establishment?
That actually happens more outside academia. That's more of a layperson's reason to not go there. And it's similar to what happened to me in the Westar Institute incident, where we're just not going to talk about that. Let's just not talk about it. So I think there are people who want to just, let's stop talking about it. You're making us look bad, or something like that. So I do think there's a lot of atheists who are angry at mythicism because they think it makes atheism look crazy.
And it distracts from
there are crazy mythicists. Yeah, there's crazy versions. Internet is full of really terrible, harebrained theories about the non-existence of Jesus. So I understand the fear. I understand what they're getting at. But that's why I did my research project. I was going to strip away everything that didn't hold up and only publish what did. And so I've actually narrowed it down to what will pass peer review. That was the whole objective, so that we'd finally have a sober, properly academically vetted case that gets rid of all of the really bad argumentation and the false facts and conspiracy theories and all of that stuff. So that was the point. So a lot of people don't know that exists, or assume that my book is just like all the other crazy stuff, and because they haven't read it. So I deal with that. But I agree with the basic idea that when we're arguing with Christians, this shouldn't be an issue. We should let's just assume Jesus existed. That's not relevant to what we're arguing about. And I have done that myself in every debate I've done. I've always just conceded, if I debate the resurrection of Jesus, I concede for the point of the debate. Yeah, it's a historical Jesus. We'll just assume that for the case here. Still, the resurrection is badly evidenced, and so I think if you're as an apologetic tactic or a counter apologetic tactic, I don't think mythicism is a useful tool for attacking Christianity, because it's so vague, it's so uncertain. Like 1 and 3, that's weak. But you can argue for trillions to 1 against God. So like you should be going for the strong argument, not the weak argument. And so I wrote an article about this too, about how this shouldn't be the weapon that we're using, if that's how we're using it. The only interest this has, and it's only atheists that should care about this, because Christians are too biased, so they're never gonna like accept objective reality on this. It's only a debate among atheists. So that's kind of an interesting question. It's the same as saying, was there really a Socrates, or was there really a Buddha, was there really a Confucius?
Yeah.
Some of these questions are answerable, some of them are not. It's an interesting question in and of itself, but it is a minority, small, obscure question, and was there an Atlantis? It's an interesting question, but it really is only interesting to historians or people who are interested in the history of it. As far as the bigger debate over religion, we should be arguing over other things. I agree. But that's not a good excuse to just not go there. I disagree with that kind of thinking. The whole not go there attitude, I think, is destructive of academic progress. And it leads to these juggernauts that you start rolling in these ruts and you can't get out of them. And so I think we do need to get away from that. But at the same time, admit that we shouldn't be using mythicism as a cudgel to attack Christians. That just doesn't make logical sense. It's a bad strategy.
Right. And then the other kind of objection I can understand from the field, at least, is this sort of growing suspicion of academia in general, of expertise versus authority, and this sort of suspicion. And you get that in, of course, like flat earthers and things like that, but you get that in this kind of social sciences and the social movements of the postmodernism kind of arguments and all those things that just crack my brain open. But it worries me when there was a study, a bunch of studies published that were based on fake data that were accepted by a journal, and it's sort of painted as something that represents all of science and academia, and represents a problem overarching. And so I do think that there is a worry that if this kind of base of science of our historical agreements were to kind of crack open, that would kind of feed into this argument that, you can't trust what academics say. And, of course, the counter argument to that is that science and scientific inquiry is self-correcting. And so that's why we reach the new conclusions and why we make corrections, so that we're more and more toward what's accurate. But I just thought I might pose that to you, because publishing your book and doing your research, and were you worried that this would feed into that argument that that you can't really trust what the establishment of science says, and kind of feeding into that?
No, I mean, that's going to happen anyway. But my concern is the other way around, is that if we aren't actually calling out fallacious methodologies, for example, weak conclusions and things like that, we are actually helping to support that attitude that science is unreliable. Because if we're just silent, we're actually defending the crap. And we're just now giving this label of science. So we're actually, science is going to suck by comparison. It's going to suffer by comparison. The more crap you allow to get in. I mean, this happened to philosophy as an academic field. I'm a philosopher, and I defend philosophy as an academic field. I think it's valid, but most philosophy is terrible bullshit. Like most peer-reviewed philosophy is terrible bullshit. It's because there's no standard for what should be.
Courtney, don't lie. I see her. She's grinning ear to ear on that one. Thanks, Dr. Carrier. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad you came on. Thank you.
But here's the point.
I love this.
But the result is that philosophy is regarded as a ridiculous field. It's not trusted. People don't regard it as an expert field on anything. And there are some really good philosophy papers that are really good. Like, it really established really good points that you really should listen to and incorporate into your worldview. But they're lost in the noise of terrible stuff. That has kind of ruined philosophy in a way. Like, by abrogating the requirement of having actual standards for what gets in. Now, they have standards, but the standards don't correlate with value, actually. It's more like, does your paper look like professional philosophy. Oh, okay, we'll let it in, which is kind of like Christian apologetics. Like what they've been doing in the last 20 years is they make their papers look like actual history papers with the proper footnotes and the whole deal. It looks authoritative. It must be good. And no, it's garbage. But they know how to make it look good. And if that hadn't happened, though, if we'd had a philosophy as an academic field that had an actual
She's
standard,
enjoying this way too much.
Philosophy's reputation would be better. So my point is, philosophy's reputation could have been better had they had a higher standard of what gets published through peer review. I mean, obviously, people can publish whatever they want, but I mean, if you're going to pass peer review, it needs to have standards that has to mean something. And doesn't mean, and by the way, even in science, peer review doesn't mean this conclusion of this paper is true. It just means it met the standards of the field. Now have at it, basically. So it's like, if you're going to critique this, you got to do your own study or replicate or whatever. So peer review is not an endorsement of the truth of a thing. The peer review is just saying this meets the standard. It's not crank. It at least meets this threshold of now it's worth your time to actually critique it or look at it. That's the value of peer review, and the same in all fields, even history and so on. But the problem is that if we allow that to happen to science, then it will happen to science, and that's bad. That's really bad. So we really do need to be criticizing. We need to calling out the fraud. We need to be catching. And if there's processes that are allowing more fraud in than should be, and more pseudoscience than should be, we should be reforming our system. Like we need to openly critique science for doing this. And if you look at history, the same thing. Like the methods of Jesus studies are terrible. Almost none of them are used in any other subject field of history, which is something should warn you right there that there's something up. So the question is why we need to critique that, because if we don't, the credibility of the field is going to be destroyed. And it's getting to that point already. Like people just don't trust authority in history anymore at all. And I get it's warrant to like not assume that every expert is right about everything. But that respect, the trust of like, well, several expert historians have said X. People trust that, I think, too much now, because I think there's in certain subject fields that are very controversial. There's no clear, reliable method in history that warrants justified conclusions. Like historians will just say, well, that's just what my gut feels. It's like, but how do you justify that logically? Like, what is the logic behind that makes that a warranted conclusion? Historians kind of run away from this argument. They don't want to talk about the logic of history or anything like that. That's a problem, and I think it's worth critiquing, precisely to hopefully move them to actually solve it, to get more rigorous, to actually get more explicit about what is the logical basis for the conclusions you're reaching. How do they follow from your premises? And what we have in history is a methodology that's accepted regarding how you collect facts. So things that get rejected from peer review are if you just make shit up, or if you say stuff that openly contradicts, well-documented facts and things like that. Or you use sources that are hopelessly unreliable, like, a gospel that was written by some monk in the 19th century, and you're using that to talk about the origins of Christianity. You're not going to get through peer review. And that's good. That's a good bar. You're at least getting rid of the total cranks. But the bar should be a little higher than that, I think. And so that I think there's a value in challenging consensus, challenging methodologies. And the fact that our field accepts that is how our field can display that it is a reliable field. I mean, a field that just completely rejects any critique or just, turns on anyone who critiques them, that's deeply suspicious as an unreliable professional field. So if you want respectability, if you want to be a believable field, like you say, this is why our field is reliable, is that we actually do self-check and self-criticize, and we accept that, and we actually improve in the result of it. You have to actually do that if you're going to claim that that's an asset for your field. And so that's why I disagree, and both agree and disagree with what you were saying there. I have a different take on it.
I should say I'm with you. I was just posing the argument because I wanted you to kind of touch on that, because it is
That's
important.
What I figured. Yeah.
I completely agree with you. And my degree is in psychology, and so I've kind of dipped my toe in scientific articles and inquiry and all that. So it's very important to me to accurately represent the multifacets of science without saying that, oh, well, we can't trust any of it. But I know that that's such a big topic right now. And maybe in the last, I don't know how many years.
Well, I mean, I'll tie this right back into psychology. people are very uncomfortable with ambiguity. So it's black or white, right? It's either all reliable or all not reliable. This idea that you're like 5% of it's not reliable just hurts people's brains. Like it's like, no, that's too untidy. The world needs to be tidier than that. So if 5% are bad, it must all be bad. I'm just going to throw it out, or I'm just going to ignore the 5% and count it all as good. That's more comfortable. People are more comfortable doing that. Like cognitive dissonance, it's an easier way to get out, is to do one of those two things. Otherwise, it's very uncomfortable, like literally psychologically uncomfortable to just live with the fact that things are ambiguous and there's nuance and it's complex and there's no, pat answer. It's not black or white. That's difficult for a lot of people. And I think that's part of our brains are built that way. And that's, like evidence against God, because God would give us better designed brains. But anyway, that's a whole side topic.
Yeah. And psychology started as a philosophy field. And so it's kind of
all science
thought to be a harder science.
Yeah.
But I know that psychology was kind of late to that game of being a harder science. And so it's
very much,
it's still not really considered a harder science. It depends on what field you're in. But I think history is probably part of that, like softer science.
Right. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but that would be off topic presently. But science is basically philosophy with better data. Is my tagline on that.
I mean, sure. Yeah.
Well, let me get to two chats I'd like to hit really quickly. The first is from Atheist Adeje. Atheist Adeje. Atheist Edge, maybe? I've never heard of these before, but
you're
saying,
I thought you were going there.
They're saying I'm not giving Courtney up. I'm gonna get into a knife fight with Nick for Courtney. I don't know. Who are these people? And then signed Jay. I don't know who Jay is, but anyways, thanks for the chat. And then read Charbonneau for you're popular. For $5, says, thanks for coming on, Dr. Carrier. Why do I run into so many believers that think King Herod killed Jesus? And what is a good example of evidence against Q?
Wait, what? Wait, hold on. The King Herod thing. There are Christians who think King Herod crucified Jesus?
Or Herod, King Herod. That's what he says.
I don't know what's. So there's two things that could be coming up there. One is the babies, right? The infants, where Herod the Great in 4 BC, 6 BC, supposedly, according to the Gospel of Matthew, tried to kill Jesus by killing all the babies in Nazareth. Now, there's no evidence this ever happened, and it would definitely have been in Josephus had it done so. But so we know that's not a true story. But that's the failure to kill Jesus. So why do they believe it? Well, obviously, Christians just believe whatever's in their Bible because they're not doing history. But the other one is there's Herod Antipas, who in the Gospel of Luke...
I think it meant Pilate. Sorry, Pilate, not Herod. I got a correction, I think.
Okay, all right. Yeah, well, okay, then I can end that thread. Well, it's because the Bible says so. I mean, that's why they believe it. And granted, like, 1 in 3 chance he did. So I don't really. It's not a threat. It's not a threat to my atheism whether Pontius Pilate actually executed an actual Jesus who was actually subsequently believed to have risen from the dead. That kind of weird stuff happens all the time. There's a religion called Caudai in East Asia where one of the 3 gods they worship is Victor Hugo. So there's a religion for everybody. Basically.
Really.
Oh, and that Jedi religion too.
It's Vietnam.
Yeah, that's
Caudai is Vietnamese. Yeah.
So
I have one more question, but I'll let you go ahead, Nick. We went for a little while.
So there's an argument that I like. Christopher Hitchens, for most of his career, argued that Jesus probably did not exist. And then later towards the end, actually came up with what I thought was a really good argument for why Jesus maybe did exist. And it's based on how the Bible is written. And one of the things that he argues is that by the time, so why are Mary and Joseph traveling, and they go from Nazareth and get stuck in Bethlehem, which is where Jesus is born. Now, presumably, if I recall correctly, the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. So they're traveling. They spend the night, manger, all that other stuff in Bethlehem. Jesus is born there. So he's Jesus of Nazareth, but he's born in Bethlehem. Now, the question is, why have this in the story? Now, if he's fictitious, you could just say, hey, he was born there, and problem solved. But if he was a real person, if there was in fact a crazy Jewish preacher who you want to turn into the Messiah, you sit there and say, oh, well, they were traveling for the census, which had presumably already been stopped several years beforehand, and Nazareth, if I recall, was exempt from anyway, but they write that into the Bible in order to move Jesus from Nazareth to Bethlehem so that he could be the Messiah. Why would you do that unless there was in fact a real Jesus that you want to square the circle and get him into, shoehorn him into that? I'm a fan of the argument. I wanted to know what you thought. And believe it or not, it's Hitchens. So
you kind of strawmanned the argument. You made Hitchens' argument weaker. By mentioning the census. Actually, the two city origin originates with Matthew, and it's Luke later who doesn't like Matthew's story and invents the census to change it. So you can't explain the origin of Nazareth with the census argument, because that was invented after the two city origin thing had already been invented. So what you want to explain is, why does Matthew invent two city origin for Jesus? Now, mind you, Mark does not say where Jesus was born. He says he comes from or lives in Nazareth, but he doesn't talk about his birth at all. And he doesn't mention Bethlehem at all. So Matthew suddenly tacks on this whole elaborate birth narrative, which is, loosely based on Moses and other birth narratives of other heroes. It's totally mythic narrative. I mean, he's completely making it up. And so when Matthew did, so it's important to note that Matthew is the first to do this. So the idea comes from Matthew. So we're talking about, why did Matthew do this? Not why did Christians do this? Why did Matthew do it? And Matthew tells us why. He says that there was a prophecy for Bethlehem and there was a prophecy for Nazareth. So he says there were two prophecies. So he's working with two prophecies, and he's trying to invent two stories to make both prophecies true. Now, in addition to this, we know that the scripture also said the gospel would come out of Galilee. So, and Bethlehem's not in Galilee. So there's already a motive to have Jesus in Galilee, to have the gospel come from there. So Matthew does this. Now, Matthew loves to do weird things like this. There's famously, when you have Mark's story where Jesus marches into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry on the donkey, right? Matthew reads the text, the scripture that story is based on. He reads it as saying that there was an adult donkey and a baby donkey, as there are two donkeys. So not only does Matthew have two cities that Jesus comes from, Matthew has two donkeys that Jesus rides into Jerusalem, impossibly somehow riding an adult donkey and a baby donkey simultaneously. I mean, this is just what Matthew does, right? So this is not history.
Well, he's got one on each foot, and he's just kind of like, okay.
It's hard to picture. Let's
like the turtles from Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, exactly.
That'd be great.
Jesus used his own hair. He roped in a couple of donkeys.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the problem. And I talk about this a lot on the historicity of Jesus. In my book On the Historicity of Jesus, chapter 4, element 9, I talk about how Christians were constructing their stories out of scriptures, and they were using scriptures we don't have. So, and they had versions of our scriptures that said different things than ours do. So trying to understand how they're building these stories out of the scriptures, you can't just go to a modern Bible and answer that question, because they're using different texts, and it makes it more complicated. But also, you can look up Nazareth in the index on the historicity of Jesus and see what I've commented there. I also talk about it in Proving History, and specifically, I have a section exactly on this argument, the argument from Nazareth, in my book Proving History, and I point out why it doesn't work. But one of the main reasons is that Jesus actually was originally called a Nazorian, which is not someone from Nazareth. And Matthew makes it clear that he's trying to explain, why is Jesus called a Nazorian? And so he says, well, he comes from Nazareth. But the word Nazorian is not the word for someone who comes from Nazareth. So it's clear that it had some other meaning. And we have other Christian sources that argue that it meant something different. Did not mean coming from Nazareth. We know the original name for the Christians was the Nazorians, but Christians didn't come from Nazareth, so it means something else. So there was some sort of other reason why Jesus was a Nazorian. And then someone, probably Mark, might have been the first one to just say, oh, I'm going to have him come from Nazareth, because that would sort of mythically fit this appellation that he has. And then I'll just use that as the basis for the story I'm going to make up. And so that's how it happened. And so we don't really have enough detail to understand how that happened or why. But there's no evidence that there really was, that Jesus really did come from Nazareth. It's never mentioned in Paul. It's only offhand mentioned in Mark. There's no theological reason why he has to have come from there historically. It's not like it's a dogma that Jesus was really born in Nazareth. We have to defend this dogma. They could have just not mentioned it, like Mark did. He has Jesus lives there, but he doesn't talk about where he's born. It's not relevant. It's only Matthew that suddenly it's important where Jesus is born. And the only reason he gives for why it's important is not history, but scripture. And so that's the problem, is like when you start picking at the threads, the Hitchens argument doesn't hold up. And I can't blame Hitchens for that. He's not a biblical scholar. How would he know any of this stuff that I just said?
Right.
But this gives you an example of how you really need to actually really look at the texts in context and really construct the timeline and understand the context, literary and scriptural and so on, to actually get at these arguments. And it's not easy. I mean, it took me 6 years to actually completely to finish on the historicity of Jesus with a PhD in ancient history. So I don't rag on Hitchens for making the argument. It makes sense for a layperson outside the field.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just get to my question. I kind of want to talk about Moses for a second, because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that the field sort of, their consensus is that Moses wasn't a real person.
Yeah. Pretty much,
Maybe.
yeah.
So
it's pretty much all mainstream scholars are either agnostic or mythicists with regard to Moses. So
okay, so I guess is there kind of a literary link between the story of Moses and the story of Jesus? Like, are they supposed to kind of follow along the same lines, or kind of be the same person almost?
Not the same person. Jesus is supposed to be the new Moses. So Jesus does everything better, right? So they take all these things, all these stories about Moses, and rewrite them. They update them to the historical context where the origin of the religion was, origin of Christianity. Update the historical context and improve them. Like make the stories sell the values that Christians want to sell. They find a lot of the values in the Moses story to be old fogey, basically, especially Mark, who's the first to do this. Mark is with the Pauline sect, who believe that we're not even supposed to follow Torah anymore. More correctly, we don't have to follow Torah anymore. Jesus saves us. His sacrifice is total, so we don't have to follow the specific weird rules, dietary and circumcision and all that. That's Mark is defending that sect. Matthew, by the way, is against Mark. He's actually he's trying to fix Mark by whitewashing that away and saying, no, Jesus was, he said, no jot or tittle is going to be erased from the Torah until the end times. So you better be a Jew, and you better be a faithful Jew, and you better follow Torah, or else you're not a real Christian, which ties into what we were talking about earlier about who's a true Christian. Yeah. So they're arguing against each other, but they're inventing myths to argue against each other. But yes, these stories, even Matthew even builds this out even more. Like he adds to Mark these 5 great discourses, which correspond to the 5 books of the Torah, right? And so he's sort of turning Jesus into the new, better Moses. So even Matthew, who's pro-Torah, wants to sell a new, superior Moses. He's not ragging on Moses. He's not saying we reject Moses. He's just saying that Jesus has really culminated. He's brought to fruition what Moses started. And Jesus is the true final Moses, basically. And so a lot of the stories, both in Matthew and in Mark, are really built out of stories about Moses. I mean, the whole birth narrative we were just talking about is constructed out of ideas that come from the birth narrative from Moses. It's to make Jesus like Moses. And that's, I mean, that's how they're constructing their myths. So yes, that definitely happens. And this has been talked about. But Dennis MacDonald has a book called 2 Shipwrecked Gospels. Thomas Brodie has a book called, I think, the first edition of the New Testament. No, wait, that's wrong. That's anyway, Thomas Brodie has a famous book about the New Testament. They both talk about how these stories about Jesus are built out of stories about Moses. Now, they also did this with Elijah. A lot of the stories about Jesus are actually stories about Elijah that are being updated and improved and then put into the history of Jesus. So we know this stuff is happening. And that's kind of mainstream scholars admit that this is going on. I mean, you can find, major biblical scholars like James Crossley and others are full on admitting like, yeah, this is, I mean, even Dale Allison will tell you like, yeah, they're doing this. We know they're doing this. The stories are built out of old heroes, is updating them into new heroes, in this case, Jesus. So yeah, that's definitely part of this. And that's mainstream, actually. That's not even a controversial, it's controversial for fundamentalists, but not for mainstream scholars.
Right. So the question I kind of had was linking the evidence we have for Moses to Jesus, and kind of like, is there, I guess, is the method that you used to study the historicity of Jesus the same method that scholars used for Moses? And is it more likely that Jesus existed versus Moses, or is it just as likely or less?
Not exactly. There's an article recently that came out by Ephraim Wallach, and I write about it on my blog. Can't you just
answer yes or no to a question? You're like,
no, reality is complicated.
Intelligent.
Wallach did a Bayesian analysis.
Be quiet.
Of the
psychologists are talking.
Oh, sorry.
I write about this on my blog. Wallach wrote an article through peer review, taking what happened in biblical studies with Moses, the change from the Exodus narrative was true to the Exodus narrative is myth. And he does a Bayesian analysis of it, showing that the process that by which scholars changed their mind about this was Bayesian. But when they were doing it, they weren't consciously doing it in a Bayesian format, right? Like they weren't aware that their arguments were and their reasoning is Bayesian. So the methods that were used in the 70s were not explicitly Bayesian. Now you can go and analyze them like Wallach did and show that they actually are Bayesian. They just are sort of covertly Bayesian. They just don't know what they're doing, what the logic is that they're using. They're not consciously aware of how that operates. So that's the answer to that question, is like they're not using exactly the same methods, but they're using largely the same methods. It's just a question of how far do you look under the hood of what's actually going on in terms of the reasoning and the logic. But there is one other difference, is that the Moses story makes a lot of claims that are easily checkable archaeologically. So the conclusion that Moses is mythical is largely based on the fact that that's all failed, that the archaeology does not hold up. And there's internal things too, like they're like camels are mentioned in the story, but camels weren't even domesticated at the time. So there's a lot of things that you can confirm through archaeology that the story is made up. So we can prove that. With the case of Jesus, there isn't really like it's such a narrow, small sequence of events on such a small scale. Like it's just some dude walking around town talking to people. Even the miracles, you can say the miracles, we reject those. There's no archaeological support for those things. But just a mundane, ordinary Jesus, you can't just say, well, no, like he went to this town and it didn't exist. And it's like, well, we're not really sure about that. Like it's too vague and mundane compared to Moses. We're not parting seas here. We're not like it's not a million Jews walking through a particular desert where there would be archaeological evidence. Right. So trying to archaeologically demonstrate that the Gospels are myth is not accessible to us. We don't have access to the kind of evidence we would need archaeologically to do it. So with Jesus, it's just literary analysis and historical source analysis. So we're looking at sequence of sources, epistles, then Gospels, not the other way around, for example. That's really important. How are the Gospels constructed? How are they telling their stories? Like you just mentioned, the stories about Jesus are overly conveniently just rewrites of Moses and Elijah and other heroes. So that's a tell. So the way we're doing it is a little bit different. Now, a lot of the Old Testament stuff was disproved or proved mythical the same way. Like the flood story we know is a rewrite of an earlier flood story from another culture, because we actually have the clay tablets of the earlier versions of these stories. Even the Ten Commandments story is kind of just sort of a sloppy Judaized rewrite of the Code of Hammurabi, because it's the same thing. Hammurabi says he got this from the god, and here's the code. And we have that. Like so we know it predates them. So we know they're riffing off of stories that other people were telling. So we do have that. We've got that similarity between the two. And for people who are interested in this, the best book summarizing Old Testament mythicization and historicity is The Bible Unearthed by Finkelstein and Silberman. It's a pop market book, but it's written by actual archaeologists and experts, and it sort of summarizes the mainstream consensus about the Old Testament and its stories.
So I just have one more short question, and then I promise I'm done, Nick.
All right, so go for it.
Yeah. So the thing, I know we're kind of running on time, but the thing that's most compelling for me on the mythicist argument, and I don't know if it's part of your argument, but it seems that the storyline and the major life events of Jesus as we know him to be are taken directly from previous deities and like you said, from Moses and things, but also kind of the major life events are taken from previous deities as well, and demagogues. And the story is written, as you've said, as more of a kind of Greek hero allegory than something that's a historical account. And so I guess when people think of Jesus as being a real person, they might look at your analysis and say, okay, well, if there's a person at the basis of it, then maybe he was just really good at, sleight of hand or something like that. But those things that are attributed to him are still copies from previous deities. So I'm curious, the person that you can say maybe existed 1 in 3 chance, is that person, what is that person like, I guess? Like, is that a person that has any of those kind of things assigned to them? Or is there anything that we see about Jesus or think of him as that's at all similar to the person that would actually be likely to have really existed?
Well, that's the big debate among mainstream scholars, right? You've got one wing who says Jesus was actually an armed, violence-promoting zealot, and the Gospels whitewash that by turning him into a pacifist. You've got like the Bart Ehrman crowd who are arguing that he was a crazy apocalyptic prophet, and maybe did some of the standard things that apocalyptic prophets did, like faith healing acts, like Benny Hinn kind of stuff, and the exorcism stuff is total placebo. We know this. So like you can explain it that way. And then there's others who think that he was kind of like a sort of mad David Koresh figure. Like there's a lot of plausible versions of Jesus you can come up with, right? You can even come up with like he was just a regular rabbi, a member of the Galilean sect, or he was a member of John the Baptist sect. And then when the Gospels came around, they just put all this miracle stuff on top of him to make him look more impressive. A good analogy to look at is the Rastafarians. I don't know if you know the story of how Rastafarian religion came about. They believe that Rastafari, who's Haile Selassie, who was the emperor or king of Ethiopia, an actual guy, early 20th century, they claimed he was the second coming of Christ, and they wrote gospels about him. They read just like our gospels with like amazing miraculous events and his preaching and all this weird stuff. And then, but he's still alive when they did this, and it's like I didn't do any of those things. I'm not the second coming of Christ. I'm a good Christian. I'm a member of the Coptic or Ethiopian church or whatever. And we were unmoved by this. It's like, well, it's kind of only the true Messiah denies his Messiahhood, kind of thing. And they explode into an international religion. They're still around. There's still Rastafarians. There's still a Rastafari Bible. So even when the guy himself he just has a really mundane life. I mean, royalty, but still, he's alive and like himself saying, no, that's not true. And yet what survives in the religion is only the Gospels. That could have happened to Jesus. Like Jesus could have been like, no, I'm not doing miracles. I'm just saying, be nice to each other. And then what happens is these wild stories get exploded and they erase the truth. Like the truth is too mundane for people, so they forget about it. Yeah. And the only people who are promoting the stories, because everyone else forgets about it, are these fanatics. So it's as if, imagine all history, only Rastafarians decided what literature would survive for us to read it. We would know nothing about the actual Rastafari, the actual Haile Selassie. And so that could have happened to Jesus. There's so many different ways to explain the evidence on a historical Jesus that I'm not confident we can know for sure. But our best source would be what would make sense of what's in Paul. I don't think it's not trustworthy. The Gospels are not trustworthy. There's this assumption that they assemble oral lore, and that's not what the Gospel authors are doing. They're writing deliberate, elaborate literary constructs from beginning to end. They're telling stories and structuring the stories on purpose for particular specific goals and messages. That is not just randomly collecting oral lore. That's not what they're doing. So we don't have any evidence that any of those stories come from anywhere. And there's even evidence like they're made up, like the story about Jesus with the coin saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Well, that's made up because when Paul has a whole chapter in Romans where he's explaining about, we got to pay your taxes, he has this sort of his own sort of argument out of his hip pocket as to why you should do this. He has no knowledge of, oh, maybe I should cite Jesus. Remember when Jesus said, no, he has no knowledge of Jesus ever saying this. No one he's writing to has any knowledge of Jesus ever saying this. So he didn't. It's just not plausible that he did. So we know they're making stuff up. So you'd have to go back to Paul and say, like, what version of Jesus fits here? One of the things that Paul says is that Jesus, according to their theology, the Philippians 2 theology, Jesus came from outer space. He's a being in outer space who serves God, descends, becomes incarnate, and dies, and then reascends and is exalted, and that's how everything else happens. But he says at one point that this Jesus surrendered everything. He submits himself to being a slave. Now, meaning not literally. He's not literally sold into service. But it's a reference to abrogating all his supernatural powers, because it says, like, he forewent his ability to be equal to God, basically. It says, like, he didn't claim equality to God, which is a reference to Satan trying to do so. Satan kept his supernatural powers, rebelled against God. Jesus is supposed to is the anti-Satan. He's supposed to reverse Satan's story. Satan chose to try to claim to be equal to God, and that caused everything wrong in the world. Jesus humbled himself, refused to be equal to God, even unto death, and that allowed him to reverse and undo all the damage Satan did, and so on. But the point being is that, according to Paul, Jesus was not a miracle worker. He abrogated all his supernatural powers during the incarnation. And that's why Paul never mentions Jesus as a miracle worker, never uses him as an example for healing or exorcism. He only talks about this being a new phenomenon in the church after his death, as this miracles, or the power to do these miracles, were bestowed upon the church after Jesus died. So it's a new thing. It's not something that Jesus did. So Jesus was probably not a miracle worker. Even though if you look at, like, the realism of the healings and the exorcisms, and I say realism in the sense that they make sense in a placebo historic sense, what's being emulated there is not Jesus, but Christian missionaries. So Christian missionaries are doing these things. Like, they're doing the Benny Hinn routine. They're doing the exorcism routine. So what they do is they paint that onto Jesus as a model and justification for what they're doing. So that story, those stories don't come from Jesus. They come from Christian missionaries and how they want to assume their identity and define their identity by redefining what Jesus did. So I don't think we can support Jesus was even a secular sense miracle worker. I think at best he had to have been just a preacher, and almost certainly a rabbi. He was probably an educated rabbi. This idea that he was an illiterate dude from Nazareth is unrealistic. Especially if he's talking about scripture. It's not like, Luke has him divine, like, people are amazed that he can read scripture and knows scripture, because an illiterate person can't do that. So for Luke, that's a miracle. It proves that Jesus is God. We know miracles don't exist. So there's no way some hick from Nazareth could quote Torah and debate with, Mishnah law and oral law and so forth, or oral law with Pharisees and stuff. If Jesus is doing that, if Jesus is actually preaching stuff based on scripture and a good understanding of scripture, he was educated. So he had to have been a rabbi, probably an educated rabbi. Possibly, we know there's a Galilean sect. So if he did come from Galilee, he was probably a Galilean rabbi. And we know the Galileans didn't like the Pharisees, and they argued with each other all the time. Well, that fits type, right? So there's a lot of things you can do like this and try to reconstruct Jesus, but it's all speculation. I mean, we're making assumption on top of assumption on top of assumption. I don't think it's accessible, really. We could just talk about what's more likely or less likely. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's mostly what I was kind of getting at, is that there's, when people think about, there had to be a source of a person to this idea. Or, if they think about maybe it was just a really good person or something like that, I feel like people don't realize how little of the Jesus story would still apply there, even if it was based on one person, because it's like, a lot of what we think we assign to Jesus isn't likely, even if it was a real person, because it's like, those are there are political reasons and historical reasons why this aspect of Jesus was attributed to him, and like why this is part of his story. And it's like, oh, well, you can map that onto Horace or whoever else. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
That's right. And that's what leads to disagreements as to which things are made up and which things aren't. And so you get the zealot hypothesis people, and you get the apocalyptic prophet people, and you get the rabbi people, and like there's different advocates for different versions of the historical Jesus. I don't think we can tell the answer to this question, frankly. So
yeah. All right, I'm done. I yield.
We'll have to have you back. We already.
Yeah.
Actually, before, because we do need to start wrapping it up, but I do have one request to make. This is a little unusual. Somebody, one of our new subscribers here, did a super chat and has a request. It's his birthday today. His name is Michael Haxon, and he just wanted you to wish him a happy birthday. If you can do that, he said it would make his day if Dr. Carrier wished him a happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Michael Haxon.
You don't want me to wish you a happy birthday, Michael?
There was. He didn't say anything about
you.
There was another $5. There was another $5.
Happy birthday, Michael. No, happy birthday, Michael.
So,
no, sincerely.
Happy birthday, Michael.
Happy birthday, Michael.
We all did it.
We all did it. He got a lot out of that super chat. Somehow I don't think the rest of ours maybe mattered to him quite as much. But all right. So. Well, we do have you tentatively scheduled reasonably soon to come back to discuss what you had mentioned earlier, because I think this is fascinating, the influence of Christianity on science. And I think now we've got like 6 other topics that we've had a lot of questions. I've got like 20 questions from the live chat that are just like, we just haven't had a chance to get them all. But we would definitely like to have you back to discuss that. We're going to put all of your particulars in the description, but just if you could remind people where they can find more information on you for the people who are interested.
Yeah, everything you can get through richardcarrier.info. So it's richardcarrier.info. You can find, my Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, my blog. You can buy my books through there. I have recommendations of readings. I teach courses every month, so you can look into what my next course will be. I'll be announcing that this week. So various things. You can find out all of online courses, I should emphasize, that on these subjects and others, philosophy and ancient history. So yeah, everything you want to know about me, you can get one way or another through richardcarrier.info.
And what was the app that you created? I forget the name of that.
Yeah, Crestus. We're still waiting on a good update on that. It's been moving around as to who owns the app, but I'm still helping when I can to build it out. It needs a lot more building out, but it's got a good skeleton there already. Yeah, it's called Crestus, Chrestus, and you can get it on Android or Apple, and it's kind of like a clearinghouse for arguments for and against the historicity of Jesus, and sort of summarizes things and has links or references to pages and articles and things like that. So people are interested in that. You can go ahead and check it out. And like I said, it'll keep getting updated, so it'll get better and better over time.
Yeah. So I learned about that when we chatted last time, and I got it then, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I just wanted to
get that
out there as well.
And for those who are curious, it has a Bayesian calculator, so you can actually put percentages and probability, or put odds. You would put odds in for various estimations, so you can test the coherence of your own reasoning using it. So for those who are interested in that's in there. It's part of the app.
And actually, before we go to, because somebody had mentioned, if you're ever in, I think it was North Carolina now, you do travel a lot, and you keep in touch with people who like your fans too. I mean, you're reasonably accessible, if I recall. As on Facebook, people want to meet you, and you're reasonably accessible.
I do travel a lot. I'm actually be dialing back on that for a bit soon, but various reasons. But but still, nevertheless, yeah, patrons who support me on Patreon, you can find my Patreon page for my blog on my blog. So patrons get more access to me than everybody else, because there's too many people. I get too many requests and too many things. But patrons at certain levels, I will actually, in some cases, go visit their town and do a pub meet in their city if they've invested enough over time. But any patron for any amount gets my attention on Facebook Messenger, for example. If you've got a quick question you want me to answer, I'll do that for a paying patron, and or email as well. But yeah, so I'm accessible in that sense. But I do get overwhelmed with too many questions and so I can't answer all emails. I can't answer all messages. But I do, like I said, I give definite priority to patrons. And you can also support me on PayPal if you don't like Patreon. I have a PayPal option as well.
And we're also, just so everybody who's watching this knows, In Time is also completely viewer supported. We have our Patreon account, and we have our Hangout is actually coming up. We do a monthly Hangout for the Patrons, and a whole bunch of other stuff, so you can go check that out. We'll have the link to that. But in the meantime, I think I've just about, have I missed anything, Courtney, do you think, or am I... this feels suspiciously easy. All right. Dr. Carrier, thank you very much. Oh, and if you do decide you want to do any debates, we host debates here too. I moderate. I've I did a little moderation for modern day debates. I've done a number of the debates over there too. But we'd love to host you. But at any rate, we do look forward to having you on again soon. Courtney, thank you again for coming, and thank you all who are in the live chat and who have contributed, and we look forward to seeing you next week when we have on Landon Knoll to discuss the impeachment, and when we cover Super Tuesday, which is going to be interesting. So until then, see you all later.